Well, I think far and away NATO's top challenge is the Russia threat. And the reason I say that is not to trivialize the Middle Eastern threat, which I'll come back to in a second, but to say that Russia, of course, is the country that has 5,000 nuclear weapons and is led by a guy who wants to challenge the European security order. We don't know how much more President Putin wants to do beyond what he's already done. But given that NATO members now extend out as far east as, of course, the Baltic states, former Soviet republics, and that there has been a fair amount of friction along that unquiet frontier, as Assistant Secretary Wes Mitchell has put it, then we really have to be concerned about the possibility of NATO-Russia conflict, crisis, or even war. And that's almost unthinkable to say. It's preposterous to have to envision at this late date, 28 years after the Cold War. But it's back on the agenda, back on the radar horizon, at least since the 2014 Crimea crisis and everything that's happened since. Obviously, the broader challenges of the Middle East, including refugees and ISIS terrorists, are a huge second threat, and they're very serious, and I don't trivialize them in any way. I would not put them as high up as the Russia threat, but I would say they're substantially more prominent than any threat facing Europe in the 1990s or 2000s, so it certainly needs to be added to the list. Well, we're seeing the Trump administration put out a national security strategy that reportedly will emphasize the need to protect America in the first instance, and I think that imagines threats like ISIS and also perhaps North Korea. It wants to promote American prosperity, and it's good to think of economic strength as a major component of national security power, and that's true for all NATO states, so I'm glad that's in the national security strategy. And then it wants to promote peace through strength, to take a phrase from Ronald Reagan and bring it back to popularity. And I think that, again, overlaps with economics, but it also envisions apparently some kind of an intended military buildup. I don't believe there'll be a big buildup, but I think that President Trump wants to do some of what President Obama had begun and recognize the rise of China and the revanchism of Russia require attention and some degree of response. I think NATO is a remarkable security organization. I would never have predicted it would thrive so well almost 30 years after the Cold War ended. I think it's very good for the international order that it does hold together. We bicker a lot within the West. We're pretty good at democratic disagreement, but when the chips are down, we tend to have common interests and we tend to stick together. And even if we have a major breach, we tend to repair it. When new political leadership moves in, for example, that tends to be one of the big advantages of democracy. Berlin is just an unbelievable city. And when one comes here and just thinks of the history, it's remarkable. It's remarkable what our German friends have done to rebuild their country and reunify it. And one more policy note is that I'm also struck at how strong our European friends are at using economic sanctions and using their economic power as a tool of security policy, because I think the sanctions against Russia over its aggressions in Ukraine have been at least as important for punishing Russia and deterring any further Russian aggression as NATO's responses. And that's a reflection of, I get to that thought by thinking about Berlin and thinking about the amazing, wonderful, powerful, economically vibrant cities of Western Europe that create the world's largest and best market. And when you combine the economic strength of Europe with that of the United States, we have all sorts of instruments of power that we need to remember we can employ as well as our military strength. I always had my reservations about NATO expansion, but I don't try to relitigate it in the book because I think it had some benefits. And also, at this point, I'm not interested in apologizing to Vladimir Putin or any other Russian about expansion. We tried very hard to work with them to make it non-threatening, and they had no right to prevent former Warsaw Pact countries, for example, from joining whatever organization they wished. So I'm not proposing that we apologize for the past or rethink previous rounds of enlargement, but I do question in the book whether future rounds, especially into the former Soviet space, are really smart and really realistic for that matter. So the whole book is to propose creation of a new security order. But if we're going to do it, Russia has to acknowledge that those countries, those neutral countries that would stay out of NATO permanently under my proposal, could join any other organization they wished and were invited to be members of, including perhaps someday the European Union, and that Russia would have to solve its territorial disputes with those countries, like Georgia and Ukraine, and presumably get its forces off their territories before this kind of an idea could kick in.